An ordinary farmer heard a strange signal beneath his field and realized the land was hiding a secret people had kept silent about for decades. Watch till the end, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The ending will stay with you. Ethan Collins bought the land because it was cheap, and because cheap things were sometimes the only ones left to men who had already spent their better chances. He did not imagine a future when he signed the papers in the cramped real estate office with its flickering fluorescent light and the smell of old coffee. He imagined distance. Distance from overdue notices, from the thin, apologetic voice of bank clerks on the phone, from the city where every street seemed to demand money he did not have. He imagined waking up without sirens, without neighbors arguing through drywall, without the constant sense that life was something being negotiated by other people. What he wanted was work he could touch in silence, he could trust. He had grown up around land, the kind that cut your palms if you didn't respect it and rewarded you slowly if you did. His father had been a farmer until the numbers stopped adding up, and pride became a liability. Ethan learned early that soil did not care about your intentions. It responded only to effort, patience, and time. That logic had always made sense to him, in a way people never had. When everything else in his life began to feel temporary and conditional, the idea of owning a piece of ground again felt like returning to a language he still spoke. The listing had been suspicious from the start. A few acres on the edge of a small Midwestern town, a weathered farmhouse, a barn that leaned but still stood, and a price that sat far below anything comparable. The realtor explained it away with vague words about market timing and disinterest. Ethan did not push. He had learned that when something was offered to you cheaply, asking too many questions sometimes made it disappear. He signed where they told him to sign, shook hands, and drove out of town with the deed folded carefully in the glove compartment like a fragile promise. The house greeted him with a tired patience, as if it had been waiting for someone who did not expect it to be young. The paint along the siding had been refreshed not long ago, but it was the thin, hurried kind of work meant to hide rather than heal. The porch sagged slightly under his weight, and the boards complained when he stepped across them. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic, the scent of long disuse rather than rot. The windows were intact but clouded with age, softening the sunlight until it felt distant and filtered, as if the house were remembering brightness rather than experiencing it. Behind the house stood the barn, gray and massive, its doors warped but functional. Inside were remnants of another life, rusted tools hung on nails, coils of rope stiff with age, and empty stalls that still carried the ghostly smell of hay. Ethan ran his hand along one of the beams and felt the grain beneath his fingers. The structure was sound enough. Everything here was. It simply needed someone willing to stay. The land stretched farther back than it first appeared, flattening into an uneven field bordered by trees and an old wooden fence that leaned as if tired of holding the line. The grass varied strangely in height, lush in some places and thin in others. Ethan noticed it without attaching meaning, the way a man notices clouds before a storm without yet feeling rain. He had learned not to romanticize property. Land was land. You discovered its character over time. The town itself sat a short drive away, small enough that a newcomer was noticed and large enough to pretend otherwise. The general store doubled as a social hub, and Ethan felt eyes follow him as he moved through the aisles. People were polite, but the politeness carried weight, like a door that opened only halfway. At the counter, an older man commented on the weather, asked how long Ethan planned to stay. Ethan answered honestly that he didn't know. That seemed to satisfy no one and everyone at the same time. It was outside that same store, loading feed into his truck, that Ethan first heard the warning. The man who spoke it looked ordinary enough, late 60s perhaps, with hands that bore the permanent stains of grease and oil. He leaned against the wall and watched Ethan struggle with the bags for a moment before speaking. "Bought the old Miller place, didn't you?" the man said. Ethan nodded. "That's right." The man's eyes flicked toward the road leading out of town. "Good land. Just don't dig too deep." He smiled when he said it, a quick, dry smile that never reached his eyes. And then he pushed himself off the wall and walked away. Ethan stood there longer than necessary, the words echoing with more weight than they deserved. In places like this, people enjoyed their jokes. He dismissed it and drove home. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Ethan recognized immediately. He repaired loose wiring, replaced cracked boards, and spent hours coaxing the porch back toward level. He worked until his muscles burned and his mind emptied. And at night he slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes only from honest exhaustion. Mornings greeted him with mist that clung low to the field, blurring the fence line until the world felt unfinished. He drank his coffee on the porch and listened to the quiet. It was not the empty silence of abandonment, but something thicker, layered, as though the land itself were holding its breath. As he began to walk the property more carefully, he noticed small irregularities. A shallow depression near the center of the field that seemed to collect water differently after rain. A patch where the grass never quite grew right, always shorter, always duller in color. He marked it in his mind the way a farmer notes stones in a plow path. Odd, but not alarming. One afternoon, sorting through a stack of old newspapers left in the barn, Ethan found a classified ad for a metal detector. The device was modest, outdated by modern standards, but affordable. He drove to the address listed and found himself in a cluttered garage where a man was clearing out possessions he no longer had use for. The seller demonstrated the detector briefly, sweeping it over a scattered assortment of scrap metal to produce a chorus of beeps. "Good for finding nails, wire, old junk," the man said. "People bury all kinds of things." Ethan bought it without much thought. On a farm, knowing where metal hid in the soil could save tires, equipment, time. It was a practical purchase, nothing more. That evening, with the sun dipping low and the air cooling, Ethan carried the detector out to the field. He moved slowly, learning the cadence of the sounds, stopping to dig up bent nails and forgotten tools. The work was almost meditative. Each signal was a small problem with a simple solution. When he reached the thin patch of grass near the center of the field, the tone changed. It was deeper, steadier, not the quick chatter of surface debris, but a low, insistent call. Ethan adjusted the settings, swept again, and felt a subtle tightening in his chest. The signal held, broad and unmistakable. Whatever lay beneath was large. He drove a stake into the ground to mark the spot and stood there for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the trees. The silence pressed in again, heavier now, and for reasons he could not explain. Ethan felt the distinct sense that the land was not merely quiet, but watchful. He turned off the detector and headed back toward the house as dusk settled, already knowing he would return in the morning. Ethan woke before sunrise. The memory of the metal detector's low, steady tone still lodged in his mind like a sound that refused to fade. For a moment, lying in the narrow bed of the farmhouse, he considered the possibility that he had imagined the strength of the signal, that fatigue and unfamiliar silence had played tricks on him. But the thought did not hold. There had been nothing uncertain about that sound. It had not wavered or stuttered like the shallow fines scattered across the field. It had spoken with the patience of something that knew it would eventually be uncovered. He dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The morning was cool and pale, the sky washed in thin layers of gray and blue. A light fog rested low over the field, blurring the fence and softening the distant tree line. The land looked harmless in this light, almost gentle, as if inviting work rather than warning against it. Ethan took a slow breath and crossed the yard toward the barn, where the metal detector leaned against the wall beside his tools. He began where he had left off the previous evening, sweeping the detector in careful arcs across the soil. The machine responded obediently, chirping at nails, fragments of wire, and bits of forgotten iron. Ethan dug them up methodically, filling a small bucket and setting it aside. Each find reinforced the logic of the device, the simple cause and effect rhythm that made the work easy to trust. He allowed himself to relax, to believe that whatever he had marked the night before would reveal itself just as simply. When he reached the stake spot, the detector's tone dropped again into that deep, unwavering signal. Ethan paused, adjusted the sensitivity, and swept from a different angle. The sound held firm, wide, and solid, stretching beneath the soil in a way that made his stomach tighten. This was not a single object. It was something with length, with presence. He drove the shovel into the ground and began to dig. The earth resisted him at first. The topsoil was thin here, giving way quickly to dense clay that clung to the blade and weighed down each lift. Roots tangled around the shovel's edge, forcing him to slow down and work carefully. Sweat gathered at his temples despite the cool air. The labor was heavier than he expected, and yet he welcomed it. Physical effort had always been his way of thinking. After several minutes, the shovel struck something solid with a dull, unmistakable thud. Ethan froze. He scraped away soil with his hands until a smooth surface emerged beneath his fingers. It was cold even through the thin layer of dirt, and curved in a way that stone and pipe rarely were. He wiped it clean enough to see a faint trace of color beneath the grime, a hint of faded paint, and then a line of metal that caught the light with a muted gleam. He leaned back on his heels, heart beating faster now. He had expected old farm equipment, maybe a buried tank or scrap from decades past. This was different. The shape suggested intention, design. He widened the hole carefully, revealing more of the object, and the curve continued, graceful and deliberate. A car. The realization came slowly, unfolding as he exposed more metal, more shape. He could see the suggestion of a wheel well, the smooth arc of what might have once been a fender. The earth around it was packed tightly, as though it had settled over years rather than months. This had not been buried recently. Ethan stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, scanning the field instinctively, as if someone might be watching. The land lay empty, silent except for the distant call of a bird. He felt suddenly exposed, standing over something that should not have been there. Cars did not simply disappear beneath fields by accident. He marked the edges of the signal more carefully, pacing the perimeter, using the detector to map the object's extent. It stretched farther than he had imagined, long and narrow, unmistakably the length of a full-sized vehicle. A chill ran through him despite the rising sun. Whatever lay beneath his land had been placed there deliberately. By midday, the hole had grown deep enough that Ethan could see more of the body. The paint, though dulled and streaked with rust, carried a hint of red beneath the dirt. The metal was intact, not crushed or twisted, as it would have been if the vehicle had been abandoned and buried by natural processes. This was preservation, not decay. The soil had protected it. He considered calling someone then. The sheriff's office was less than 20 minutes away. He could step back, let professionals take over. The thought should have brought relief, but instead it stirred an unexpected resistance in him. He wanted to understand what he was looking at before surrendering it to others. It was his land, his find, and his instincts told him that this discovery was not a simple matter of lost property. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his concentration. Ethan turned to see the older man from the general store standing near the fence line, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He had not heard a vehicle approach. "You found something," the man said. It was not a question. Ethan nodded slowly. "Looks like a car." The man walked closer, peering into the hole. The color drained from his face as he took in the exposed metal. He straightened, eyes darting briefly toward the house, then back to the field, as if measuring distances and escape routes. "You should stop," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. "I mean this isn't scrap," the man replied, "and it isn't forgotten." Ethan studied him more closely now. The man's hands trembled slightly, and his voice carried a tension that went beyond curiosity. "Do you know what it is?" The man hesitated. "I know what it might be." He introduced himself then as Walter Hayes, a retired mechanic who had lived in the town his entire life. He spoke carefully, choosing words as if each one carried weight. He told Ethan that years ago, long before Ethan had ever heard of the place, there had been talk of a car like this, a red one. A man who drove it had vanished, and with him, the vehicle. Officially, the story ended there. Unofficially, people stopped asking questions. Walter looked down at the hole again. "Some things were better left alone," he said. Ethan felt a flare of irritation. "If it's something serious, shouldn't the police know?" Walter's mouth tightened. "That depends on who you think the police are." The words hung between them. Ethan understood then that whatever lay beneath his field was woven into the town in ways he did not yet grasp. He thanked Walter for the warning, but when the man left, Ethan did not fill in the hole. Instead, he covered it temporarily, shielding the exposed metal from the sun, and stood there until the afternoon light shifted. That night, as darkness settled over the farm, Ethan lay awake listening to the creaks of the house and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. His thoughts circled the image of the buried car, the way the metal had felt under his hands, solid and waiting. He sensed that he had crossed an invisible line the moment his shovel struck that surface. Whatever lay beneath his land was no longer content to remain hidden, and neither, he realized, was he. Ethan worked in silence the next morning, the words Walter Hayes had spoken settling into him with the slow weight of truth. The warning had not been dramatic, not the kind that came wrapped in threats or raised voices. That, more than anything, made it difficult to ignore. It had been delivered like a fact, like weather or age or gravity, something a man did not argue with so much as account for. Still, Ethan found himself drawn back to the field as soon as the light was strong enough to work by, compelled by a mixture of curiosity and the stubborn sense that retreating now would only leave questions to rot where answers should have been. He uncovered the hole again, peeling back the protective layer of soil he had packed over it the evening before. The metal reappeared beneath his hands unchanged, patient. In daylight, the color was easier to see. The red was muted and dulled, but unmistakable, the kind of red meant to be noticed, meant to announce presence rather than hide it. Ethan had seen enough vehicles in his life to recognize the deliberate elegance of the lines. This was not a utilitarian farm car or a cheap commuter vehicle. It had been built to impress. He expanded the dig carefully, widening the pit a few inches at a time. The soil around the car was compacted differently, layered as though it had been placed there deliberately rather than settling naturally. Each shovelful confirmed what his instincts already knew. Someone had buried this machine with care, not to discard it, but to conceal it. As the contours of the car emerged, so did a strange sense of reverence. The shape of the hood, long and sloping, hinted at a time when style mattered as much as function. The chrome trim, though pitted and scarred, still clung stubbornly to the body, catching light in brief flashes. Ethan found himself imagining the car as it once had been, polished and loud, parked beneath neon lights or cruising down a street where people turned to look. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the quiet field where it now lay entombed. Walter returned late in the morning, this time in his truck, which he parked at a careful distance. He watched Ethan work for a while before speaking, leaning against the open door as if ready to leave at the first sign of trouble. When he finally did talk, it was with the resignation of a man who had decided that silence was no longer protecting anyone. They called it the Silver Lounge, Walter said. Used to sit right off Main, back when Maine meant something. Ethan paused, resting his hands on the edge of the pit. What was it? A club, a bar, depends who you ask. Walter's gaze drifted toward the town, invisible beyond the trees. Music, gambling, deals made in back rooms. Folks came from counties over. Money flowed in that place. Who owned it? Ethan asked. Walter hesitated. Name was Frank Donnelly, or that's what he went by. He liked to be seen, always had a smile, always had a story, and he had a red car. People talked about it more than they talked about him. The name stirred nothing in Ethan, but the image aligned too neatly with what lay beneath the soil. What happened to him? He disappeared, Walter said. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. Official story was that he skipped town, left debts behind, took his car and ran. And no one believed that? Walter gave a short, humorless laugh. Some did, or pretended to. Others knew better, but knowing and proving are different things. Ethan looked back down at the car. You think this is his? I think if that car could talk, it would have a lot to say, Walter replied, and none of it would make anyone comfortable. After Walter left, Ethan returned to the work with renewed focus. He dug until the outline of the vehicle was clear, exposing the side panels and the contours of the doors. That was when he noticed the seams. The doors were closed, but not in the way doors were meant to be. Thick, uneven welds traced their edges, crude and functional, sealing them shut. The same marks appeared around the trunk. Whoever had done the work had not cared about aesthetics, only finality. Ethan's stomach tightened. Welding doors closed was not something done lightly. It required time, tools, and intent. He crouched closer, running his fingers along the hardened metal, feeling the ridges where molten steel had cooled decades earlier. This was not vandalism or convenience. It was confinement. He stepped back, breath coming a little faster now. The car was no longer simply an object of curiosity. It was a container, and containers held things. The thought pressed in on him, heavy and insistent. He tried to imagine the interior, the space sealed away from light and air, and found his mind resisting the images that followed. For the first time since he had begun digging, Ethan considered the possibility that something inside the car might not be inert, that it might not be empty. He walked the perimeter of the pit again, noticing details he had overlooked before, a faint discoloration on the soil near the rear of the car, the way the earth had compacted more tightly around certain areas, as if settling around a shape rather than collapsing naturally. He leaned closer to a narrow gap where glass had fractured long ago and was partially obscured by dirt. A smell reached him then, faint but unmistakable, the stale, organic odor of something that had once lived. Ethan recoiled, his heart pounding. The rational part of his mind scrambled for alternatives, for explanations that did not lead where this one did. An animal, perhaps. A coincidence. But the sealed doors, the welded trunk, and the stories Walter had shared aligned too cleanly. This was no accident. He paced the field, trying to slow his thoughts. The sensible choice was clear. Call the sheriff. Step back. Let the system take over. But another voice, quieter and more insistent, urged him to continue just a little further, to confirm what his instincts already believed. He feared that if he turned away now, the truth would be buried again, not by soil, but by procedure and indifference. By late afternoon, Ethan made his decision. He would finish uncovering the car, not to open it, not yet, but to see it whole, to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He arranged to rent a small excavator under the guise of clearing old drainage lines, careful not to draw attention. The machine arrived just before sunset, its engine noise briefly shattering the field's quiet before settling into a steady hum. As the excavator peeled away layers of earth, the car emerged fully from its grave. It sat there like a relic, red paint dulled to the color of dried blood. Chrome dulled but intact. The shape was undeniably beautiful, even now, and that beauty made the wells and scars all the more jarring. Ethan stood beside it as the light faded, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. He covered the pit once more before darkness fell, standing alone in the field as the last of the sunlight drained from the sky. The land seemed to settle around him, quiet and watchful, as it had the first night he marked the spot. Ethan understood then that the soil had not simply been hiding an object. It had been holding a secret, one that was no longer content to remain buried. When he finally turned toward the house, the weight of what lay beneath his field followed him, pressing close, promising that the next step would change everything. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ethan lay awake listening to the house breathe, to the soft pops of cooling wood and the distant chorus of insects rising and falling beyond the walls. Each sound felt sharper than usual, as if the land itself had grown attentive. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were crowded with images of red metal and sealed doors, of hands pressing from the inside of something that would not open. He woke before dawn with the taste of iron in his mouth and the uneasy certainty that whatever rested beneath his field had already crossed some invisible boundary into his life. Morning light found him back outside, standing at the edge of the pit with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. The earth looked different in full daylight, less mysterious and more accusatory, as if daring him to pretend ignorance now that so much had been revealed. He studied the tarp covering the car, its edges weighted down with stones. The wind lifted one corner, and for a moment the dull red curve beneath flashed like a warning. He spent the early hours doing chores he did not need to do, repairing a fence that had held just fine the day before, checking water lines that showed no signs of trouble. It was work born of avoidance, the kind that kept his hands busy while his mind circled the same unresolved question. By mid-morning, he had exhausted even his own patience. He set his tools down and walked back to the field. Walter Hayes appeared again not long after, this time on foot, his pace unhurried but deliberate. He stopped short of the pit, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The excavator tracks were still fresh, dark lines pressed into the grass. "You're still at it," Walter said. Ethan nodded. "I needed to see it whole." "And now that you have?" Ethan hesitated. Now I can't pretend it's nothing. Walter studied him for a long moment. You planning to open it? The question hung between them. Ethan did not answer right away. He had asked himself the same thing a dozen times since the night before, and each time the answer shifted, shaped by fear one moment and resolve the next. I don't know, he said finally. Part of me thinks I should call the sheriff and let it go. And the other part? The other part thinks that if I don't look, someone else will, and they might not be as careful. Walter sighed. That's how trouble justifies itself, as necessity. Do you think I should stop? Ethan asked. Walter looked toward the trees, then back at the house, as if measuring distances that were not physical. I think this land has been quiet for a long time because it was allowed to be. Once you break that quiet, you don't get to choose what comes next. He turned to leave, then paused. If you do open it, he added, don't do it alone. The warning stayed with Ethan after Walter disappeared down the road. By noon, he had made his choice. Not with the clarity of certainty, but with the resignation of a man who knows that some paths, once found, cannot be ignored. He drove into town and rented a cutting torch from a small equipment shop, whose owner asked no questions beyond payment. On the way back, he stopped at the feed store, where the clerk mentioned the weather and nothing else, and Ethan felt a strange gratitude for the ordinary rhythm of small talk. He waited until late afternoon to return to the field. The sun hung low, casting long shadows that stretched across the grass and pooled in the pit. Ethan uncovered the car again, the tarp whispering as it slid free. The machine sat exposed now, fully revealed, and in that moment it felt less like a discovery and more like a confrontation. He circled it slowly, noting details he had missed before. The white wall tires, flattened but intact. The emblem on the hood, dulled but still proud. The faint outline of upholstery visible through broken glass. This had once been someone's pride, their declaration of success or freedom or defiance. The thought made the welded seams all the more unsettling. Ethan set the torch aside and sat on the edge of the pit, elbows on his knees. He thought of his father, a man who had believed that land remembered everything done upon it, that soil was not passive but patient. He wondered what memories this field held beyond the one he was about to uncover. As dust settled, the air grew cooler, and a thin fog began to creep up from the low ground near the trees. Ethan hesitated again, the weight of the moment pressing in. He told himself he could stop, that covering the car once more would buy him time, perhaps enough to hand the problem to someone else. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was already too late. The question had taken root, and unanswered questions, like buried things, have a way of forcing themselves back to the surface. He lit the torch. The hiss of gas cut through the evening, quiet, sharp, and intrusive. The blue flames sprang to life, bright against the deepening shadows. Ethan lowered it toward the seam along the trunk, his hands steady despite the pounding of his heart. The metal resisted at first, then began to glow, sparks scattering like fireflies as the torch bit into the weld. The smell came almost immediately stronger now, a mix of scorched paint, old rust, and something else beneath it, something organic and wrong. Ethan turned his head, breathing through his mouth as he worked slowly, carefully, tracing the line of the seam inch by inch. The metal groaned softly as it expanded, a sound that made his skin prickle. When the cut was complete, he shut off the torch and stepped back, letting the metal cool. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the field itself were holding its breath. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans and reached for a pry bar, testing the edge of the trunk lid. It resisted, then shifted slightly with a dull, reluctant sound. A wave of air escaped as the seal broke, carrying with it a stench that made Ethan stagger back, gagging. He dropped the bar and bent over, hands braced on his knees, fighting the urge to retch. His eyes watered, and for a moment the world narrowed to the sound of his own breathing. He straightened slowly, forcing himself to look. The trunk had opened only a fraction, enough to reveal darkness within, thick and absolute. Ethan could see nothing clearly, only vague shapes swallowed by shadow. But he did not need to see to understand that what lay inside was not empty. A sudden noise made him spin around, heart leaping into his throat. It was only the wind, rustling through the trees, but the relief was fleeting. The field no longer felt empty. It felt watched. Ethan stepped back from the car, every instinct screaming at him to stop. Whatever remained inside the trunk had waited decades to be discovered. It would wait a little longer. He covered the opening as best he could, lowering the lid without sealing it, then pulled the tarp back over the car with shaking hands. By the time he returned to the house, night had fully settled. He locked the door behind him, something he had not done in years, and stood in the darkened kitchen listening to the familiar sounds of home. They did little to calm him. His mind replayed the moment the trunk cracked open, the rush of air, the smell that clung now to his clothes and skin. He knew then that the line he had crossed could not be uncrossed. The car was no longer just a secret buried in his field. It was a presence, and it had begun to assert itself. Whatever story it held was no longer content to remain silent, and Ethan understood with a clarity that left him cold that the hardest part of what he had started was still ahead. Ethan did not sleep at all that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, a single mug of cold coffee untouched in front of him, listening to the wind scrape along the siding like restless fingers. The smell from the field lingered on his clothes no matter how many times he washed his hands. It had embedded itself somewhere deeper than skin, carried on memory rather than air. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the narrow opening of the trunk, the darkness behind it, and felt again the wave of something old and wrong escaping into the present. Just before dawn, he made his decision. He pulled on his boots, layered his jacket against the chill, and stepped outside as the sky began to lighten to a pale, uncertain gray. The land was quiet in that peculiar way that existed only between night and morning, when even birds seemed reluctant to break the stillness. Frost clung to the grass, and his breath rose in slow clouds as he crossed the field toward the pit. The tarp lay exactly where he had left it. No sign of disturbance, no footprints, no marks beyond his own. The rational part of him took some comfort in that, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in his chest. He uncovered the car again, more slowly this time, as if granting it the courtesy of acknowledgement. The trunk lid was still loose, resting in the imperfect alignment he had left it. Ethan stood there for a long moment, hands hanging uselessly at his sides. This was the point of no return, the moment when suspicion became certainty. He told himself that he needed to know, that leaving it half open was worse than finishing what he had started. The land deserved closure, if nothing else. He braced himself and lifted the trunk fully. The smell hit him again, stronger now in the cool morning air, thick and unmistakable. He turned his head away instinctively, fighting nausea, then forced himself to look. His eyes adjusted slowly, taking in shapes that resolved into terrible clarity. Inside lay human remains, collapsed inward with time, bones tangled with the remnants of clothing that had long since lost any recognizable form. The skeleton was incomplete in places, but unmistakably human, curled as if forced into the space without ceremony or care. Ethan staggered back, his legs unsteady. The world seemed too bright, too ordinary for what he had just seen. He pressed a hand to his mouth, swallowing hard, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it could be heard across the field. This was no accident, no rumor exaggerated by time. This was murder, preserved by soil and silence. As the initial shock settled into something colder and heavier, he noticed something else in the trunk. A leather briefcase lay beside the remains, its surface cracked and stiff with age, but intact. It did not belong there by chance. Someone had placed it deliberately, as if it mattered enough to be buried alongside the body. Ethan hesitated only a moment before reaching in. The leather was brittle under his fingers, but the clasp gave way with a dry snap. Inside, the contents were a mess of papers fused together by moisture and decay, but enough remained legible to tell a story. Names, dates, numbers, deeds, ledgers, correspondence. The fragments of a life entangled with money and influence. He recognized some of the surnames immediately, names still carried by families in town, etched on plaques and storefronts. His stomach tightened. This was not just a dead man in a trunk. This was evidence. He closed the briefcase gently and set it aside, his hands shaking. The weight of what he held pressed down on him with crushing clarity. This discovery did not belong to him alone. It never had. Whatever secrets were written in those pages reached far beyond his field, beyond his farm, into the foundations of the town itself. The sound of an engine broke the stillness, distant at first, then closer. Ethan froze, panic flaring. He looked up to see Walter Hayes' truck slowing at the edge of the road. The older man climbed out, his expression tight even before he reached the pit. "You opened it," Walter said quietly. Ethan nodded, unable to speak at first. He gestured toward the trunk, the briefcase resting on the ground beside it. Walter approached, his movements careful, respectful, like someone stepping into a church or a graveyard. When he saw the remains, his shoulders sagged slightly, as if a burden he had carried for years had finally settled into place. "So it's true," Walter murmured. "All of it." Ethan found his voice. "There are papers, names. This isn't just him. Whatever happened here, it involved others." Walter closed his eyes briefly. "I was afraid of that." They stood in silence for a long moment, the morning sun climbing higher, illuminating the car in stark, unforgiving light. Finally, Walter straightened. "You have to call the authorities, now, not later." "I know," Ethan said, and he did. The part of him that might have hesitated the day before was gone, replaced by a grim resolve. This was no longer about curiosity or stubbornness. It was about responsibility. The sheriff arrived within the hour, followed by deputies and then investigators. The field filled with unfamiliar vehicles, their presence jarring against the quiet landscape Ethan had known for years. Yellow tape went up, sealing off the area, and professionals moved with practiced efficiency around the pit. Cameras clicked. Notes were taken. The car, the trunk, the remains all became objects of methodical attention. Ethan answered questions as best he could, his voice steady even as his mind reeled. He told them about the metal detector, the signal, the digging, the welds. He mentioned Walter's stories, the Silver Lounge, the man who had disappeared. The sheriff listened carefully, his expression grave, and nodded as if pieces long missing were finally sliding into place. When they removed the briefcase, one of the investigators glanced at Ethan with something like respect. "You did the right thing," she said. Ethan was not sure it felt that way. As the car was finally lifted from the pit by a crane, mud and roots falling from it like shed skin, he watched with a strange mix of relief and loss. The field looked wounded without it, an open scar where something had slept for decades. By the time the vehicles pulled away, carrying the car and its secrets with them, the sun was low again. The land seemed quieter than before, if such a thing were possible. Ethan stood alone at the edge of the empty pit, the briefcase gone, the trunk sealed once more by official hands. He knew the story was far from over. Investigations would follow. Questions would spread through the town like wildfire. Old names would be spoken in new ways. But for the first time since the detector had screamed beneath his feet, Ethan felt a fragile sense of certainty. The truth was no longer buried, and whatever consequences followed, they would no longer belong to the soil alone. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, unreal rhythm, as if time itself had been unsettled by what had been pulled from the earth. Ethan remained on his farm while the outside world pressed closer than it ever had before. News vans lined the road by the second morning, their satellite dishes angled toward the sky like curious insects. Reporters appeared in pairs and clusters, some polite, some aggressive, all hungry for details Ethan had no desire to repeat. He turned them away as best he could, retreating into the house and letting the authorities speak for him. The sheriff returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with state investigators whose presence carried a heavier gravity. They walked the land again and again, mapping the field, measuring distances, photographing soil patterns and excavator marks. Ethan answered the same questions repeatedly, his words becoming rehearsed even as the meaning behind them refused to dull. Each retelling carried the same weight, the same cold realization that the quiet life he had built here had been irreversibly altered. Walter Hayes stopped by less frequently now, and when he did, he stayed only a short while. He seemed older somehow, his shoulders stooped beneath a burden that was not entirely his own. One afternoon, as they stood near the porch watching a deputy photograph the edge of the pit, Walter spoke with a tired honesty Ethan had never heard from him before. "People are going to talk," Walter said. "Some already are. They'll say you went looking for trouble, that you should have left it alone." Ethan nodded. "I know. And some of the names in those papers, Walter continued, lowering his voice, they still mean something around here. Power doesn't disappear just because time passes. Ethan met his gaze. Neither does truth. Walter studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow, approving nod. Just make sure you protect yourself. Men who buried things like that didn't do it out of fear alone. That night, Ethan locked his doors again. He began to notice small changes he could not explain. A truck parked too long at the edge of the road before moving on. A phone call that ended the moment he answered. Once he found a fresh set of tire tracks near the fence line that did not belong to any of the officials who had been there earlier. None of it was overt enough to accuse, but together it formed a pattern that kept his nerves taut. The investigators kept him informed, though always in careful, measured language. The remains had been identified as Frank Donnelly, the former owner of the Silver Lounge. Dental records had confirmed what rumors had long suggested, but never proven. The car was indeed his, a rare convertible from the late 1950s, reported missing the same year he vanished. The welds on the doors and trunk matched equipment used by a local machine shop that had closed decades earlier. More troubling were the documents from the briefcase. Though many pages were damaged, enough survived to paint a clear picture of corruption that reached into the town's past like a root system. Payments to officials, protection agreements, names of men who had built reputations as pillars of the community while quietly profiting from Donnelly's operations. Some were long dead. Others had children and grandchildren who now occupied positions of respect and authority. The town reacted in stages. At first there was shock, followed by fascination. People gathered at diners and gas stations, lowering their voices as if the land itself might be listening. Then came denial. Old-timers dismissed the findings as exaggerated, insisting that Donnelly had been a criminal who deserved whatever fate he met. Others accused the investigators of dredging up the past for attention. Ethan felt the shift most keenly in how people looked at him. Some treated him like a reluctant hero, thanking him in hushed tones for bringing the truth to light. Others avoided his gaze altogether, their discomfort palpable. A few regarded him with thinly veiled resentment, as if he had violated an unspoken agreement by refusing to let the past remain buried. One evening, a letter appeared in his mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing only a short sentence typed in block letters. "You should have left it alone." Ethan stared at the words for a long time before folding the paper and placing it in the drawer beside his sink. He did not show it to the sheriff. Not yet. The message was vague, but its intent was clear enough. Someone was watching. Someone was angry. Despite the tension, life pressed forward. Crops needed tending. Animals needed feeding. The land did not pause for human reckoning. Ethan found solace in the physical work, in the predictable rhythm of labor that reminded him the world was larger than secrets and threats. Yet even as he worked, he felt the ground beneath him differently now, aware of the history it carried, the things it had absorbed and released. Late one afternoon, the lead investigator returned alone. She stood with Ethan at the edge of the field, where the pit had been partially filled in, its outline still visible like a fading scar. "We're closing in on the full story," she said. "There will be consequences. Some people are going to answer for what happened, even if it's long overdue." Ethan nodded. "And after that?" She considered the question. "After that, the town will decide what to do with the truth." When she left, Ethan remained standing there as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. He thought of Frank Donnelly, of a man whose ambition and fear had ended in darkness beneath another man's field. He thought of the silence that had followed, the decades of quiet that had allowed lies to harden into tradition. He understood now that uncovering the past did not resolve it neatly. It exposed fractures, forced choices, demanded accountability, and it demanded something of him as well. As evening settled in, Ethan returned to the house and closed the door behind him. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in slow waves, whispering across the place where the car had once slept. The land was quieter now, but it was not empty. The final reckoning was approaching, and Ethan sensed that the last chapter of this story would not be written by investigators or courts alone, but by the choices people made once the truth could no longer be denied. The investigation ended not with sirens or arrests in the dead of night, but with paperwork, court dates, and the slow, grinding weight of facts made public. That, Ethan learned, was how the past finally lost its grip, not in a single dramatic moment, but through repetition, exposure, and time. Names that had once been spoken with respect now appeared in print beside words like bribery, obstruction, and conspiracy. Old photographs resurfaced. Forgotten connections were traced and retraced until denial became impossible to sustain. Some of the men implicated were long dead, their guilt sealed in history rather than prison cells. Others were alive, elderly, and diminished, forced to answer questions they had spent lifetimes avoiding. Their families closed ranks, issued statements, hired lawyers. The town watched it all unfold with a mixture of shame and grim fascination. What had once been whispered was now discussed openly in grocery store aisles and church parking lots. The silence that had protected the truth for decades was gone, replaced by an uneasy honesty. Ethan stayed mostly out of sight. He testified when asked, answered questions when required, and otherwise returned to the rhythms of his land. The reporters eventually moved on, their vans disappearing one by one, leaving behind flattened grass and a town still unsure how to look at itself. The yellow tape came down. The pit in the field was filled in completely, leveled and reseeded, though the grass there grew thinner and paler than anywhere else. The letter never received an answer, and no others followed. The truck that had lingered on the road stopped appearing. The phone fell silent again. Whether the warning had been meant to frighten or simply remind him that some people resented the truth, Ethan never knew. Over time, the tension in his chest loosened, though it never vanished entirely. Some knowledge, once gained, did not leave a man unchanged. Walter Hayes moved away in the spring. He stopped by one last time, standing with Ethan at the edge of the field where the earth now looked whole again. He said little, only that it was time for him to be closer to family, farther from old memories. Before he left, he placed a weathered hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did what a lot of us couldn't," Walter said, "or wouldn't." Ethan watched his truck disappear down the road, understanding that the town was shedding pieces of itself, slowly and painfully, like a snake leaving behind its old skin. When summer came, Ethan planted a young maple tree near the center of the field, not as a marker, but as a gesture. He worked the soil carefully, pressing the roots down, covering them gently. The act felt familiar, grounding, growth in place of concealment, life where something had been hidden too long. The seasons turned. News of the case faded into archives and footnotes. The Silver Lounge became a chapter in the town's history rather than a rumor passed between generations. Children grew up knowing the story as fact, not mystery, that more than anything felt like a kind of justice. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, Ethan would sit on the porch and look out over the land as the sun dipped low. The wind moved through the grass and the maple's leaves whispered softly. He no longer imagined the car beneath his feet, or the sealed trunk, or the darkness that had waited so long to be found. Instead, he felt the steady presence of the earth, unchanged in its patience, honest in its memory. He understood now that the ground did not keep secrets out of malice. It kept them until someone was ready to listen. And once heard, those truths asked something of the living courage, responsibility, and the willingness to live with what had been uncovered. Ethan had done that. He had listened. He had acted. And when night fell and the stars came out one by one, reflected faintly in the windows of his quiet farmhouse, he felt something close to peace. Not the innocence of ignorance, but the calm that came from knowing the land beneath him was no longer bearing a lie. The earth remembered, but it no longer carried the weight alone. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch our other videos for more true mysteries like this, and don't forget to share this video with someone who loves dark, real-life stories.